Charlie Luxton, one of the UK's leading sustainability architects.
Flattered.
I would describe you as. Charlie, look, thank you very much for talking to me today about the Planning and Infrastructure Bill.
Yep.
I know that you're aware, obviously, of this and some of the constraints within the current system that we're working to at the moment, some of the legislation and the constraints for wildlife protections, and that sort of butting up against development. And the government, as it stands at the moment with the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, wants to rip it up, basically, rip up the systems that we've got at the moment in favour of supercharging the economy and building more houses. They want to get building. But within that, the rhetoric has been anti-nature, I think it's fair to say. Bats, newts and spiders have been cited as being held responsible for stopping developments at scale. Now, from an environmental perspective, we have issues with what is being proposed through the bill at the moment. It's now at its third reading, so MPs are looking at it at committee stage. And there's some core things in there around species protection that we are really worried about, because it means that all of that protection, particularly through the Habitats Directive, will go effectively for British wildlife. Now, at the same time, the kind of perversity of all of this is that the government are proposing a nature recovery plan within the principles of the infrastructure bill. So you're probably thinking, well, why? Why are you now testing this? But the conversation I want to have with you today is just kind of for me to step out of where I am, my position, as in protect this, protect that. We all want nature's recovery. We know that nature does the most amazing job and we absolutely need it. It underpins our economy, our health and well-being, all of that kind of stuff. Nature has value in its own right. So I need to get out of my box, and I really want to talk to you about kind of where you see the whole bat, newt and issue. Is it really the stumbling block, or is it a process issue?
So my take on it is that we need to protect and enhance biodiversity. We have a biodiversity crisis in this country. I think all of that is, acceptable. I think you'd have to be blind not to see it and appreciate it. I have a problem with the way in which the protections are currently undertaken. So I think it's quite interesting that there was a review recently, I can't remember by whom, but somebody within government who looked at this stuff and actually came back and said, there's not really a problem with legislation, it's a problem with process. Yeah. And I would 100% agree with that. So we are a 11, 12 person practice in North Oxfordshire. We've probably got about 9 or 10, 12 million pounds worth of projects just stalled because of the bat season and newts. Okay. Now, I want to protect bats and newts, but I can't even put my planning permissions in to know if I can even build them from a planning perspective, because I have to wait sometimes 6 months to get bat surveys. The bat surveys are very, they're expensive, they're multiples of them. Now, I completely understand if you've got planning and you are definitely going to build something, you need to create something that is not going to destroy habitats or roosts for bats or newts in the process. But I don't even know if I'm going to get planning for these projects. Yeah. And my clients are being asked to spend £10,000-15,000, and these are not big projects, maybe a £3 million project, a lot of money for that project, to find out if there might be some newts in a pond 400 metres away. Yeah. And just to put this in the crazy context of the world we live in, these are farmers who release about 5,000-10,000 pheasants a year, which we know destroy newt populations. And they're perfectly entitled to do that. And they're not doing that to destroy newts at all, far from it. They like wildlife, but they do a small-scale shoot on their farm. But they're allowed to release these pheasants, which we know destroys newts, but then they have to spend £15,000 doing eDNA data on some ponds 400 metres away in case newts get harmed in the construction, when we don't even know if we've got planning. Yeah. So what I would say is there needs to be a situation where you can go into planning without knowing what the nature is, and it should be at the risk of the person who's putting the planning in, that you go in, you get your planning permission, and then if you can't then prove the ability to build without damaging, in fact, the opposite, you can't prove the ability to build and enhance the biodiversity of the site where you're building, I would say actually turn it around and use building as a positive thing, then you can't go ahead. And they're called conditions. They exist. We do it for all kinds of stuff, about materials, and we do it for all kinds of stuff. We get planning permission, then we discharge conditions, and then we build.
Yeah.
But the way that it's currently set up is so process driven, it is ludicrous. It is becoming increasingly expensive prior to knowing if you can build. It is ludicrous. And if you wanted to create a system that turned people against BATs and newts, you couldn't do much better than the one they created.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, I'm here in 4 acres of land. We have planted 900 trees. We've done, 3,000 square meters of wildflower. We're letting it go natural. We're managing it for nature's recovery. I am not putting a newt pond on. Because if I do, and then I want to extend my office, well, I'm up for thousands of pounds to prove that there is or aren't newts here. And suddenly it's like, well, why would I do that now? I'm not doing anything with that until do you know what I mean? And that's crazy. Yeah. But the system has made us get to this point. So I think there is not a problem with legislation. There is a massive process the way in which the process is undertaken. And I actually think a lot of underfunded planning authorities have used the nature side to stall planning permissions for their own internal requirements.
Okay.
I actually think that's what is going on. Now, that's an accusation people might throw back at me, and I would retract it if you could genuinely show me that's not the case. But, who benefits from this? Well, the planning officers benefit because they can just push stuff down the road and they can wait. And up until now, they're in a thing called they're in a scarcity mentality. They are overworked and understaffed, right? Yeah. Under-resourced and probably underpaid. And therefore, the most important thing for them is time. So they'll just like, whatever, I don't want, I've got to get through my workload. So if I can save BATs and newts and push this down the line for 4 months, bring it on and I'll do it. Yeah. So there's a massive problem right there that I feel we need to really look at. Now, I know that there are lots of schemes coming forward. There's district licensing schemes where you can pay to make this problem go away. And it feels to me, and what I really worry about in the planning infrastructure bill, is that everything they're doing is about big developments. And we know that the big developer system does not deliver quality housing. We know that it doesn't deliver good communities, and we know it alienates the people around which it's being built. And we know that ultimately they are so profit driven. The levels of profit for the large house builders is off the charts. I mean, it is in the high 20s when Tesco's run at 4.8% profit. So that is what we've already allowed. And it feels to me like the government is just pandering to the big developers even more by saying, buy your way out of this problem.
Yeah.
They've already created a system which is so two-tiered.
Yeah.
Big developers, big pockets, deep pockets can do what they want. And they're just adding to that. My clients, we don't do that kind of scale of stuff. We can't afford the district licensing scheme, and ultimately what happens to that money? Where does it go? How is it deployed? So there's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And I suppose my worry, Einstein said this wonderful thing, right? He said, you can't solve a problem. I might get this slightly wrong, but something like, you can't solve a problem with the same head that created it, right? The same way of thinking that created it. And what I worry is that the people that invented all the process that has led to this problem are now trying to change that process to get rid of the problems that they created with the way that they think, because it's all a top-down process-driven thing. Yeah. What it actually needs to be about is getting people around the table, big and small, not just the lobbying house builders who absolutely dominate the debate. Yeah. It is about everybody in this sector, medium, small, large, coming together and understanding, the planning officers, coming together to discuss it. Yeah. And I also think that there is a massive challenge around the siloed way that these things are done. So the nature stuff gets completely carved out. It's like, great, you got no bats, you got no newts, just do what you want. And we're not really bothered about what you put back in and what species you put in and how you actually improve the nature and the biodiversity on your site from doing it. Biodiversity net gain is coming in to start dealing with that. But it really feels like there's just too many silos, and that's not how you turn it around, because right now we are not seeing a turnaround in nature and biodiversity crisis. Yeah. I think that was a rant.
That's absolutely fine. I mean, we've got the system that's locked in effectively to a way of doing it, and I can see what the government are doing and trying to sort of upend that and go, well, let's try and do things a little bit differently. But I think that the key point that you make there is that we haven't had that conversation
No.
with the big, the medium,
No.
the small,
No.
the charity, everybody coming together and really trying to unpick this and solve it. We do need housing. We need places for people to live. Totally get that. And we need healthy nature as well. You know, the UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. You know, there is no argument about that. So how do we have both? You know, how do we genuinely create this win-win situation without undermining things like the precautionary principle, mitigation hierarchy, polluter pays principles, and all that kind of stuff? Because the plans as they are proposed at the moment, developers would pay into this pot of, you know, something over here, and, you know, to develop, no surveys would be done, nothing required, just go in and do it. There'd be some sort of environment development plan or whatever associated with that. The money would then disappear back into government. They pay into this nature recovery fund that goes, it would be administered probably by Natural England, who are strapped for cash anyway.
Struggling.
Absolutely
Struggling.
Yeah, they can take
They're failing to deliver, from what I understand, and again, I could be wrong, they're failing to deliver the schemes that they've already got in place. They're not particularly doing well with those, from what I understand.
They've got no money. You know, they keep being stripped of budget year on year. And they will be given this knowing that they could take an administration fee out of it. Everybody needs to cover their costs, don't doubt that. But it's like, how are they going to respond to this, all of a sudden, this big, you know, oversight piece that they're going to have to look at and take care of for the whole of the UK, effectively?
Look, I mean, you know, we've got to remember where this has come from, you know, and the poster child of this whole thing is the bloody BBOWT tunnel on HS2, which is clearly madness, right? In my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Clearly 120 million on whatever level and for whatever reason just seems a disproportionate amount of not only cost, but remember, when you spend a penny, you create carbon pretty much. In you know, a pound, you create carbon. So the carbon associated with creating that BBOWT tunnel and all of that, I have no idea. I don't know enough about it, but you know, I can see why people get deeply kind of you know, unhappy about it, because it does sound like a very poor decision. And part of that, I think, comes from my understanding of the legislation, is that you can't damage any bat population, and therefore you can only add to things, which does feel very straitjacketed. So, for example, if you can't like kill 10 newts to make 1,000 newts. That's just not how the European wildlife Act has worked, in my understanding.
Yeah.
And if that is the case, from what I understand, that does seem disproportionately rigid. But equally, I am very concerned about something that says, well, you don't need to do a survey now, just buy your way out of this problem and we'll sort nature's problems. You don't know what you're destroying.
Yeah.
You really don't know what you're destroying.
That's the key point.
And that does worry me significantly. Yeah. I think, but what needs to happen is that you need to have a sequential proportionary approach, you know, i.e., go and do an initial survey on land. Is there anything that's absolutely like flashing red lights? This is really valuable. You need to know that.
Yeah.
How can you not know that?
Yeah.
But whether you then say you can't touch this, there's not a chance in you know, hell you're ever going to build here. It's like, well, what can we look at how we can do that? But can we do it without thousands and thousands of pages of reports? You know, effectively all the money that should be going to be spent on nature is being spent on reports, in my opinion. And you know, and that's the kind of narrative that gets spread around. And all I can say is, from our experience of a medium small scale practice, I see it.
Yeah. And do you think that we can do nature better in the built environment?
100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely, no question. I mean, without doubt, you know, more about native species, more about better landscape conditions, more about how we get nature onto our buildings in a sustainable way, more about understanding the role of the site of a project and how you can offset the carbon and biodiversity, you know, and biodiversity net gain. I mean, biodiversity net gain to me is a really exciting opportunity. I think that level of dynamism, if you like, that it can introduce to this space is so great. And you know, we've been talking about projects. I'm looking at a project down in Berkshire on an estate. We're looking at stuff up in Scotland. We're looking at stuff in, you know, where people are thinking, right, we can use the funds that will come out of this to create some really amazing places. Yeah. That's so exciting. Yeah. So I do think there is some logic of saying, well, this area has got a relatively low biodiversity amount. we can create something of high value somewhere else. I think there should be dynamism. I think if you can create 10 units of biodiversity somewhere and half a unit somewhere else for the same cost, I'd be tempted to have some weighting to allow that to happen. Again, it all comes down to the process. And if I'm honest, and I'm going to say it, and again, it probably isn't a very popular thing to say, is that I just don't know if the civil service is up to the challenge in its current form. And I see it in all kinds of areas where endlessly, and I've seen it a lot in architecture, and I've driven, created this, this idea or this understanding or this position from watching the way in which they've tried to do low energy housing schemes. It has been a, pardon my French, shit show from start to finish. And the government's own investigations have said this has been an absolute disaster. Whoever ran this should never be, should not even be able to run a bath, let alone a scheme. So, it's not without precedent that they don't seem to be up to running these things because they're complex and difficult.
Yeah.
And it's not because they're not clever. I think they just got the wrong approach.
Yeah.
So I feel like we can run around and we can say, too many bats, too few bats, everything you want. But until we actually drive down to the core, which is understanding how we create better processes to make the central legislation actually work on the ground, I feel like it's just been the wind, whistling in the wind.
Yeah. And I guess linked to that, we do have the local nature recovery strategies being developed at the moment. So there will be a blueprint about where best we can spend money to do more for nature. But again, that is a natural England thing, a DEFRA thing. So we'll have to come
see
back
how that gets delivered, and whether it's delivered in a dynamic, sensible way, or whether it just gets sunk in its own process.
Exactly.
Again,
and then we got nutrient neutrality, biodiversity net gain. Who knows how that's going to work in this new system? We hope that that's not going to get torn up and just thrown out.
Well, my big concern, if I'm honest with you, Estelle, is that I think the government have made a colossal strategic mistake. By coming into government, coming into the new parliament, taking over the reins, if you like, and saying we're going to build 1.5 million houses in the next parliament, that's just such a disaster. Because I think there's one area of the economy that pretty much everyone agrees that it's broken. It's the housing sector. Yeah. And they've just turbocharged it. It's like, what are you doing? You've effectively just said to them, we are desperate for you to build. We need you to build. But we need you to build better. It's like, well, we just won't build for a bit. And guess what? In 2 years' time, you'll let us build anything. And you'll let us bulldozer over any nature, forget, the bats, newts, whatever, just build, which is ridiculous and not acceptable. Yeah. What they could have done is said, we're going to build 300,000 houses by the end of this parliament, last year of this parliament, which is probably what will happen anyway. And in the meantime, we're going to radically rewire the entire system and look at it and just slow down a second, get the right system in place, and then turbocharge it. But they haven't done that. So I really am desperately concerned that as a response of this strategic blunder, in my opinion, there's going to be a slew of very poor decisions for both nature and environment with watering down of legislation controls on this sector. It's certainly not tightening up. So it's bleak, in my opinion. Okay. Now, I was speaking to some Labour MPs about this recently, and they're saying there are some new announcements coming out, and it'll be interesting to see how the government respond and whether they really understand the time bomb they've started ticking. Yeah. But, it's watch this space. But if I could have any input on this, it's just like don't worry so much about the bloody legislation. Just vaguely agree what you want to do and work on a good process that is proportionate and efficient and efficient. Yeah. So the money actually gets used helping nature and biodiversity, not paying for consultants driving around doing yet another survey and writing another 1,000-page report that no one bloody reads. Yeah. Okay. I totally see that. And I hope that government, who seem to be making, number 10, seem to be making the decisions and not listening to the department, so the environment guys, the housing guys, they take all of that, this is all supposed to be kind of science driven, the case is put forward to do things properly, and then number 10 are just making a kind of arbitrary decision about whether to do something or not. Politics, absolutely. Politics, not science. Yeah, totally. And, we've spoken to MPs of different colours, and I know that they're obviously looking at laying amendments down at the moment. They're saying, do you know what? I feel like I don't have a voice
because I'm a different colour. If I put an amendment down, they're going to chuck it out straight away because I'm a different colour. They don't care. Could be the best amendment in the world, but they don't care because it's not theirs. So for me, that's a worry. Anyway, our political system, I think, needs looking at.
Well, now we're unpicking the whole fabric. Undoubtedly.
We probably don't need to go
we're
there.
getting off subject.
Yeah, we're getting off subject. But
I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a massive issue that they have made this stuff political through the way that they're talking about it. And if we are going to go another step back, the question is, do we really need growth or do we need fairness?
Exactly.
I don't see a money crisis in this country because I see some very wealthy people, and there is more money in this country than there's ever been. So there's not actually a money crisis. There is a distribution of wealth crisis.
Yeah.
Growth, is that really going to help? I don't know.
Yeah.
I genuinely don't know because, effectively it's like the housing crisis. It's a classic one. What's the housing crisis? So it's a crisis of affordability, right? So how do you actually deal with affordability? You have to bring the house prices down. Well, who are the one people that do not want house prices to come back down? House builders. Who are you asking to try and solve the housing crisis, which is an affordability crisis? House builders. I mean, literally, the thinking is so flawed on so many levels. I slightly despair.
Yeah.
But, we can't change all of that. What I would go back to saying is please just involve these sectors that you're working in trying to understand how we can improve these processes, whatever they're about. For too long, we have relied on a centralized approach of civil service, central government and politics, and it has failed repeatedly. That's the thing that needs to change, in my opinion.
Yeah. Ultimately, we can't build on a dead planet, can we? We need to invest in nature as the most sustainable way of growing anything, basically, in this country. But I think we can draw it to a close now, Charlie. It's been fantastic to talk to you. Thank you very much for sharing your sage words.
I'm not sure they're sage words, slightly ranty words, but no, I think it's a really important area. So it's great, it's great work that you guys at the Wildlife Trust are doing to lobby on this area. Yeah,
and crucially, it's good for us to understand really what the core issues are. And I think if we can get people together around the table, possibly pause what's going on at the moment and go, hang on a minute, we think we can solve this in a different way, in a super reasonable way. Let's do that.
Good luck.
Thanks, Charlie.